Hello, and welcome to another episode of the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, and friend, John McKinnon, the author of The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician. And together, we're discussing weaponized religion, how Christian identity fused with early Christian fundamentalism and politics to form the foundation for the new Apostolic Reformation. John, I'm really excited for today's episode. Charles and I actually talked about this subject in great detail whenever we did the historical walkthrough of William Branham's ministry. But it's so complicated. There's so many facets to this. And when you combine British Israelism, it gives it another view into what was happening and why it was created. But then take a step back even further in time, Anglo-Saxonism, and you find all of the foundation that was laid that enabled the two-seed doctrine of Christian identity, which is one of the most racist theologies that has emerged in the past few centuries. This is really, really bad. And you can go out and if you just type in Christian identity or two-seed doctrine. In fact, Wikipedia has a really good article that goes through the some of the problems with it. But the place that I point people to usually is the Anti-Defamation League. The Bible says, "By their fruits you will know them." Well, the fruits of this doctrine alone, ignoring everything else that we've uncovered, just the fruits of this doctrine alone lead to militias and political wars. And I'll just read from the Anti-Defamation League's website. It says, Christian identity is a religious ideology popular in extreme right-wing circles. Adherents believe that whites of European descent can be traced back to the lost tribes of Israel. Many consider Jews to be the satanic offspring of Eve and the serpent, while non-whites are mud peoples created before Adam and Eve. Its virulent, racist, and anti-Semitic beliefs are usually accompanied by extreme anti-government sentiments. Despite its small size, Christian identity influences virtually all white supremacists, and extreme anti-government movements. It has also formed criminal behavior ranging from hate crimes to acts of terrorism. This is a very horrific doctrine, and I'm glad that we get a chance to go a little bit deeper into this and how it swayed Christian religion of the early 1900s through even now, today, this still exists in some extremist sects.
Yeah, John, I'm real happy and excited to be involved in this episode and the ones that's coming up. These episodes that we're putting together is really going to bring all these connections together. Like you said before, it's like a big puzzle, and the message and everything that happened through that is only one piece of the giant puzzle that's morphed into all these other groups. But there's so many variations in this doctrine too. Each one has their own separate spins on it, depending on what group you belong to. So we can explore, and we're going to explore all those variations somewhat, and see how they migrated into certain groups, some into the white supremacy groups that exist today, such as the Aryan nations, Christian identity. Some of it migrated into the message. Some of it migrated into Ku Klux Klan's doctrine. But they all have these connections. They all are, it's like a big spider web, and they all are a part of it. But this episodes will let us show the listeners exactly how they fit in the pieces of this puzzle. And as we talk, the way this came about, of course, it came from Britain, but it goes way, way back when all these ideas started. But the political climate, the religious climate of America at the time when all this came together was just ripe for this type of doctrine to enter in, for a mostly white America that was Protestant, that saw the changes in America they didn't want happening. And we'll go through some of those as to what was happening, where that group of people just did not want to see that happen. So these groups that just arose was the perfect storm for this kind of thing to happen. That's how, a doctrine that comes, and it comes at the right time. People are just ready to hear it. And that's how this happened. But there were some other things that played a part in the growth of the Klan and all these ideas, which we'll go into. So, so we'll touch on all those things, and but there are some variations to the doctrine that each group has their own spin on. But yeah, I'm excited about getting into this.
Growing up in this thing that I grew up in, we refer to it as the message. I had no idea that this was a white supremacy doctrine, and yet it was fundamental to the religion's belief system. Without this, you really can't have the quote-unquote message. And by the time that I was of age to understand what they were saying, they had so far taken the racial elements out of it. They all were there if you went back into the recordings of William Branham, but they tried to take it to a spiritualized serpent seed. I heard one minister say that it was a physical bloodline between Eve and the serpent until the flood, and then it became spiritual. And you had a spiritual good guys and a spiritual bad guys. But in its essence, they all take it back to the bloodlines, and it is literally the means to say that there are a people and a lesser people. In all extremist groups, the message included, that use this doctrine, it is really to belittle the people who don't believe in your belief system. And so as we get into this, I think we'll show how that goes. But when this doctrine originated, with British Israelism, this was the white descendants of Europe, basically, that turned into this two-seed doctrine. It began as a not discrimination against the people who did not have the white skin. It began as a somewhat elite royalty. I think in our last episode, I mentioned the Scottish Declaration of Independence. This was just simply stating that they were prideful, that they were part of the body of people that descended from the children of Israel. Whether they did or not, that's irrelevant to the point. They took pride in it. And over time, especially in the upper status peoples and groups and settings, they use this as a means of showing their prestige from a Christian viewpoint. The royalty believed that they were the royal seed of Abraham, and so they took this and they ran with it as a political means to show that they're showing pride in their Christianity, basically. So it wasn't such a bad thing from its inception, but like all belief systems that are not truly based on fact, what happens is that people get to thinking about the other side of the equation. So if we are the royal seed and we with white skin or the Anglo-Saxons are the the special chosen ones, well, then that by default means that the others are not.
Yeah, and to build on what you said there, yeah, the very end result of these things in America it's turned into the violent type groups, the groups that see things just are slipping away from them, the way America's changing, and they have nothing else they can do but resort to violence just to try to maintain control. But in reality, they don't have control. They lost it a long time ago, which is good for everyone. But when you go back to the beginnings of this two-seed doctrine, it just seems so strange, but many groups of people want to believe they're the true Israelites. They have no Jewish blood in them at all, but they want to claim heritage to the Jews. And I don't know why that is. I guess it's because the Jews were chosen as God's people to bring this knowledge of salvation to the world and to bring Christ through the Jewish race. But everyone wants to claim some of that lineage, and they do that through the Christian identity, through the British Israelism. But this thing can go back as far. There's several groups, even back to some of the Afghanistans. They had a theory that they came from Israel. Then the British did, which became, Christian identity. The French even had their version of it. The Scandinavians did. and even the Native Americans did, and believe it or not, the Japanese do too. And there's many others, that hold to this, some type of doctrine that says, we were descended from the true Israelites, and we're the true Israelites, and the people that inhabit Israel today are not. So there's just some prestige about that. And in one sense, for the British people, it gave them the feeling that they have the right to rule, and everyone else that's not of the descendants of Israel are their servants. So it creates a class society, which that's what America wanted. They wanted a class society where the white people ruled, and all the people of colored skin would have to be the servants, and they wanted to stay that way. And they use this doctrine as a basis for that. Some have said that calling them mud people, they were the pre-Adamic creation. If a minister's preaching that, he's more along those lines. And then the one that descended from the serpent. What's so absurd about that is that the serpent was a beast, and there's no chance a beast can even mate with a human. But the message believed it was actually a physical seed line that produced Cain. So the reality to that, if it really was, then we would have beast human people today. They wouldn't have been lost. They would have been mingled in all the human race, and we could have been able maybe to identify it with DNA. But we know that beasts and humans do not mix. So, and there's some things we could get into with the scripture to show, if you follow it chronologically, it's not possible for, Eve and the serpent to have had Cain. But, I've even heard in our circles a long time ago, I heard this, that William Branham could actually identify if you were seed or not. He could use his discernment, and he could tell if you were really genuine seed or not. Another kind of absurd claim. But the first one I could find that articulated the British Israel doctrine into its kind of modern form was a self-taught Scottish person named John Wilson. It was he lived in the 1800s, but in 1840 he gave a lecture, and a man named Edward Hine attended that lecture when he was a teenager. And Hine claimed that Wilson was speaking something that lodged that thought into his mind and heart, and from that day on he began to study all the evidence he could about Britain's identification with Israel. So Hine eventually established that a British Israel Identity Corporation, and then as the doctrine spread through Britain, organizations arose, and his organization was challenged and marginalized through that. So eventually he left for America, and that's where I can see it coming into America around. That was in 1884, and then he gave lectures. By that time he was well versed in British Israelism. He gave lectures throughout the northern part of eastern United States and Canada, and in America there was another man named Joseph Wilde. He was already spreading the doctrine in America too, in the mid-1800s on up to the 1900s. But Hine, and you mentioned Charles Totten in your notes. So Hine and Charles Totten had helped Wilde's efforts, but believe it or not, there was another person that already had some roots preaching British Israelism in America named William John Cameron. And this was in the early 1900s by this time, but he was a journalist for Henry Ford. And I won't go into more details maybe a little later, but Henry Ford, was the one that embraced the Protocols of Zion, the Learned Elders of Zion publication. And Ford at the time didn't know it was a hoax paper, but Ford began to promote it, so it became a treatise against Jews. And Ford later recanted that, but it had already gotten into the system, and the doctrine was beginning to spread already. Although Ford said he backed up from that, but Cameron, which was his journalist and all that, and just embraced it and ran with it, and that's what continued this doctrine, and that's where the hatred of Jews came. Of course, there was a lot of immigration occurring at the time, and that kind of ties back into the Klan when we get into that, the startings of the Klan. And I'll mention something more about that later, about how immigration, the hatred of the Jews and the people of color, and white supremacy all mingled together, came together at one time.
We should probably pause also and talk about some of just the fallacies with the methodologies in which they came to these conclusions. If you trace the lineage back, through each individual race, there's you mentioned DNA. Well, there's also a common DNA point, right? And as you said, humans can't mix with the beasts of the field. And so what happened was, in the latter rain movement especially, which I'm at least familiar with Branham and some of the heads of latter rain, they took the word in the Bible, the beast was the most subtle of the field, and they began claiming divine revelation, like this was something new, and said that this word subtle implied or suggested that the beast at one time was upright and walking and was able to actually have sex. Because if you think of a snake, it would be very difficult for a snake a human to mate, right? Well, this idea itself wasn't anything new. Also coming out of Scotland, we've mentioned Scotland at least 3 times now in this episode. There was a Scottish translator named Adam Clarke, and he began speculating on exactly that. How was the beast more subtle? And he came to the conclusion by making leaps that you should never make. He would take words that were in Hebrew, and he would find words in Arabic that sounded similar. It didn't even mean the same thing, but he would make this leap because the word sounded similar. And in his view, the serpent walked erect and had the ability to speak and was basically a creature that was in between the humans and the ape kind. So he is one of the earliest ones, and I'm certain that there were some before him, but he was one of the earliest ones that took the snake from the Garden of Eden and morphed it into this creature which could mate with a human. Which is interesting if you think about the latter rain movement, because this is what William Branham claimed as new divine revelation. The snake was not like the snake we have today. He could mate. But that's not something that the Bible says. This is extra biblical. And so this laid the theology, one of the premises for Christian identity. It laid the theology that there was a different type of beast that was not like the beasts that we have today, but was in between the human, and that created a lower class of human. If you're a Lord of Rings type of fan, you've got the human, you've got the hobbits, and then you've got these orcs or whatever. So essentially these guys were creating fantasy, and these were the orcs. What happened was that laid the foundation for a lesser class of human. And like you said, there's this explosion of bad things that happen in the United States. You mentioned the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. So you've got the British Israel Doctrine, which is coming in with the 2 seed out of Scotland. So you've got the upper class of humans, the lower class of humans, mixed with now the Jews are of this great conspiracy, so they must be of the lesser class. And like you said, William Cameron ran with this, Edward Hine. It was printed all throughout the Dearborn Independent. And as we go further in this podcast, we'll talk about the foundation that was laid that brought that into latter rain, the anti-Semitism, the 2 seed. It also opened the door for the pre-Adamic race, as you mentioned. That was one of those elements essentially make up the Christian identity. To identify yourself as a Christian in this very destructive, dangerous movement, to identify yourself as a Christian, you had to identify yourself as being part of the good bloodline, as not part of the orcs or the lesser, they called them mongrels, basically. So it's an offensive term, but there were humans in America that weren't having white skin from Europe's flavor of white skin that they called mongrels, right to their faces. I mean, that was out in public. And all of this came into latter rain through William Branham and Roy Davis, which we'll get into further in this podcast series.
So, yeah, John, and to go back to all these characters we've mentioned, that's basically how it was brought into America. Joseph Wilde, Hine, Charles Taunton. And going back to Billy Cameron, or William John Billy Cameron, as why he's important is that, Henry Ford had published a paper, I guess, to say that he supported or believed the document of the Protocols of Zion. And Cameron published a series of articles that became a book called The International Jew, The World's Foremost Problem. And he also wrote for a newspaper, and he was a staff writer for the Detroit News, so he had a lot of publicity. And he was part of a British Israelite movement, and of course they closely associated with the Anglo-Saxon Federation, served on the executive committee. So things were very exploding in the North with this doctrine. It was very getting embedded in America. Cameron interpreted the Bible as a racial book, and he was the first one to claim the Jews are not God's chosen people. So the Jews that everyone called Jews in that time were not God's chosen people. So it gave the people of America that embraced that a reason to hate the Jews, or a reason to promote anti-Semitism. Is if it was proven that they were really not God's people, then there was no reason to honor them or to let them have special privileges as we being Christians want to honor the Jews. He also helped start the transition of the British Israelism to Christian identity. So I think that's very important to know that this man had a great influence in that transition time to what became Christian identity here in America. Another interesting thing about Cameron, and this is a name that you've thrown out many times, Cameron was a large contributor to the minister Gerald Winrod. So there's a connection there, how Cameron was contributing to Gerald Winrod's ministry, which I know you'll get into. So that's pretty much the background that we start from as we get into this. And like you said, to place one group of people into the beastly category gives you a reason to, make them a lesser than human, and a reason why you should be able to rule over them and to take dominion over them, as in Genesis mandate says you should rule over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And the Christian identity movement believes that was only given to Adam and his race, not to the serpent and the race from the serpent.
Exactly. And if you think about the transition from what was brewing in Europe to coming into America, and this explosion of ideas that became Christian identity, understand that it is a very political thing. When you mention people like Henry Ford, who had deep connections not only to American politics but also overseas, this kind of thing is the kind of thing that makes you or breaks you. Henry Ford allowed it. He did not write it, but he allowed it. And I was reading one article, they were talking about, Henry Ford later denied all of this, but there was one witness that said there was nothing that passed Henry Ford's desk but what he did not give his stamp of approval on before it was executed. And knowing how business works and knowing the business elites, I can assure you that if this thing were continuing as long as it did, Henry Ford had to have known. There's no way that he did not know that this anti-Semitic doctrine was flowing from his own newspaper. But all that aside, it's entering into American politics, late 1800s. It's starting to transition to a very racial thing. Long before, you mentioned the name Edward Hine and also William Cameron. Well, these two were the heads of the Anglo-Saxon Federation, which we mentioned last episode. Gordon Lindsay was speaking at those conferences. So this is the point in time in which it's beginning to transition into Christian identity. But there's a problem with this in that if you're bringing such an idea that is offensive, this is truly an offensive thing, you can't continue with it if it's not accepted by your listeners. So whenever they're printing the Dearborn Independent, there had to be people that would ascribe to this idea, right? And so that's where this gets really interesting, because while the majority of the doctrine that emerged into Christian identity did come from Europe through British Israelism, you also had some American connections to this. One of the names that we mentioned, I think, long back in the historical podcast was Daniel Parker. And Daniel Parker, in the 1800s, as this is developing in Europe, was developing the same thing in the United States and in the areas that we're concerned with as we start talking through this podcast. Parker was a Baptist, and he was extremely influential in, throughout Texas, throughout Indiana, Virginia, Tennessee, all of the areas that we're going to be talking about as we go forward. But in 1837, he had become so popular that there were men going through, basically going through all of the areas of his influence to see and document how that they had progressed. And one of those areas just happened to be New Albany, Indiana. And you remember in Latter Rain, William Branham's claim was that he had a prophecy that he would live near a city called New Albany. And Parker, his claim, and I'll just read his quote directly. He claimed and said, "The serpent seed I believe to be the non-elect, which were not created in Adam, the original stock, but were brought into the world as the product of sin by the way of a curse on a woman who, by reason of sin, was made susceptible to the seed of the serpent, through which means of her husband, who partook with her in the transgression, and therefore became the medium through which the serpent's seed was and is communicated through the woman, because she became the mother of this seed." So if you think about what that is saying, it's not quite the Christian identity Latter Rain version of it, but it is describing that something happened within the first human female that allowed a dark or a evil seed to come through Cain, is what he claimed, and then the good to come through Adam. He had not yet taken the leap of what came in through Scotland of the beast being upright. So you take Parker's influence and Parker's doctrine with this new idea coming in out of Europe, combined with the protocols, which is the idea that the Jews were this lesser race. Mix all of this together on the fertile ground in America that had been influenced heavily by Parker. You've got people who will listen. I'll just say it like that. There were a lot of people who wouldn't, because Parker was deemed extremist by the Baptists, and the Baptists denounced Parker over this and other things Parker was doing. So it's not like all Christians in America believed it, but there were some that had been infected with Parker's doctrine that this was very appealing. Now we see coming out of Europe the same thing that Parker said, that I believe, and now maybe Parker was right. And any of the groups that Parker influenced, which covered a huge swath of the United States, they were now more willing to accept this doctrine.
Yeah, John, it's this character you mentioned, Daniel Parker, was a very influential minister, Baptist minister, very strong predestinarian Baptist, so much so that he rejected missions. He didn't believe that you would even have to have missions, because if you were born into the world, you were either born on the good seed or you were born in the bad seed, and the bad seed had no chance. And if you were a good seed, God had to save you anyway, so there was no need to evangelize. So he was very strong on that, but he was influential in many churches, founded churches, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Illinois, and Indiana. He published his version on the two-seed doctrine while he was in Vincennes, Indiana in 1826. And as you mentioned, that was only a couple hours from New Albany, Indiana, where William Branham and his family had moved to. But he was definitely a very strong influence, but I don't know how well received he was around there. But eventually he made his way to Texas, and Texas was still just a territory that Mexico still owned at the time. And in and it was very Catholic down there, and you had to have, there was no organized church allowed, but what he did was organize his own church in some way, and either as a corporation or whatever, but he organized his own church here while he was in America before he moved down there. But he ended up in Texas, and it was not far from Paris, Texas, and places that Davis is even known to have come from in Texas. So in that same area, east of Dallas, Texas, is where he settled. So he spread that doctrine down there quite a bit too. So I imagine his influence had a very strong part to play in Davis hearing it. And even William Branham's mother was from Paris, Texas. So even their family being affected by this doctrine. So it was just infiltrating America, and more people were picking up on it. And it just fit the times. It fit where they were. And it was something that, you want to feel elite and because you want to be the privileged race, right? And that's how this thing took off. But there's so many more people we could mention. I mean, it just goes on and on. The people that supported this doctrine, but it was very widespread.
And when you think of the similarities between Parker and other people who claim to have divinely received this revelation of the good guys and the bad guys, it gets interesting because I mentioned the article where the Baptist was touring through New Albany, and he basically determined that there were 3 classes of Baptists in the area. And again, this is the area where William Branham spent the majority of his life. So there would have been influence, because that influence was established as early as 1837, I think I said. But he describes Daniel Parker. He said, Mr. Parker is an uneducated man, having, as he himself says, been raised an Indian hunter, and never understood the smallest rule in arithmetic. And when you really think about where that leads, so this is a man who came up with this concept of the 2 seeds. I think it was 1826 he published his works on that. This is a man, again, who's uneducated. He has no basis for this other than a spiritual claim. By spiritual revelation, I claim that there are good guys and bad guys. But he was an Indian hunter. And when we think of the class system, he was classifying the Indians as this lesser seed. And so this is long before it came to the point in which the people with black skin were considered the lesser seed. He was actually considering the Indians, the Native Americans, to be the lesser class of people, or the seed from the serpent, if you read into what is going on in his life. So before it even took a racist against the African Americans or the Jews, this was a racist thing that was happening against the Native Americans of this country.
Yeah, John, those comments you made just kind of struck home to me for a minute and got my mind thinking on a couple of scriptures. Back in the last episode, I mentioned that certain men crept in unawares, those that were foreordained to this condemnation, but there was one scripture there, but there was another one that came to mind that's talking about probably the times we're living in, where Paul was talking to Timothy. He said, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving others and being deceived. And when you mentioned Daniel Parker's version and how he came up with it, and then the message itself, this, everything we're mentioning about this doctrine, there's nothing in this doctrine that can be of heavenly origin. I believe it comes, this just confirms to me that it comes from a satanic origin. This whole doctrine is satanic. I think the whole thing, I hope the listeners can see that. And when they're embracing this doctrine, it's definitely not of God, and it only produces evil. And everything we're mentioning here, you can see all the fruits of it. It goes right back to what you said in the beginning. The fruits of this thing is not good. And we're just exposing it. But this just hit me just now to think about that's exactly what's happening, is that these men are not I don't know how they got influenced, how they are preachers of the gospel and can have these feelings toward other people, because Jesus did say, preach the gospel to every creature, every person in the world, and as he that believeth, not he that's not of the serpent seed. He didn't say that. He didn't say divide the people up into different seed types and only preach to the good seed and don't worry about the bad seed. But that's exactly what these people are doing, and that's exactly what the message will do to you. If you question, one word of it, they'll throw you right into the category of bad seed and write you off, and that'll be the end of you. You'll be ousted from your church, your family, as the people you've had on your podcast have been explaining. But it just goes to show you what this doctrine, where it come from. And I believe it's so clear. If it's not clear to anyone right now, just keep listening, and you'll see how clear it'll become.
Exactly. This was a means to divide people, pure, plain, and simple. And that's not, the Bible says that it was for all who would believe. It doesn't say for all with white skin who would believe. And fast forward to today, they're descendants of this two-seed doctrine that they try to twist it and claim that it's not a physical bloodline thing, even though, when William Branham spread it through the latter rain, it was a physical bloodline. And he talked about how it went through Noah and through Noah's sons, I should say. This was a physical bloodline, but they've twisted it to make it sound not so racist so they can still cling to it. But in the end, it is literally saying that the power of the gospel is not enough to save if you are of this evil bloodline. If you take all of what they say out to its logical conclusion, which is problematic. But, when you think about the roots of where this came and how it entered into the latter rain movement, which, as we're going to show through the podcast, it descended into the New Apostolic Reformation. All of this foundation was laid. It has some very strange roots, and Parker is key to basically he's the one who made all of the fields. He planted all of the seeds in all of the fields all throughout the areas that this began to develop. When we get into Roy Davis, this was before Texas was even fully formed as a territory. He was down throughout that area. I think it was called the Missouri Territory, if I remember correctly. And this is the area where Pentecostalism was birthed. You had Charles Fox Parham, who was in that same region. And where it gets really interesting is I studied Paris, Texas, because working with the family historian of Roy Davis and all of his family hailed from Paris, Texas. And this was another region. Davis was also a Baptist when he was in Texas, so this would have had some influence from Parker. And in Texas, especially in Paris, Texas, it would have been a accepted doctrine because they were very, very racist against people with black skin. And Paris, Texas was it was a site where the most famous lynchings after the Reconstruction happened. So Davis is in one of the most notorious areas of Texas, and they were stringing up African Americans they even have photographs of the lynchings that they had back in the late 19th century, earliest 20th century. There were approximately 468 people lynched in Texas, and Paris was a hot spot for the lynchings. And again, you can't really directly tie Roy Davis to Daniel Parker, but Parker had a heavy influence in Texas, and these people were against people with black skin. At the same time, you have Pentecostalism being birthed, and not many people realize how racist that Charles Fox Parham was. Especially when you read Parham's book, The Everlasting Gospel, you can kind of get a sense for it. He talks about the races mingling together like hogs. He calls the blacks and whites mingling as though they're mingling in the mud with each other because of their skin color. And Parham believed that the greatest sin of humanity was the mixing of the races. So he is coming from an area that's influenced by Parker, and he's very against race mixing. This is a history that's widely untapped today because Parham has become this, weird great founder of the faith, even though towards the end they will admit that Parham was having some relations with young boys, which is problematic. But long back, I was working with a author named Bernie Wade, and he was working on a book that was the history of Parham, but also the history of racism in Pentecostalism. The book is a very excessively pro-Parham book, and at the time I was working with him, I'd not yet found where Parham had admitted himself to the sodomy claims against it wasn't a boy, it was a young man that was with him. And I was unaware that there were a long history of similar things happening, and that during his trial there were witnesses who attested that their children were also the victims of Parham. So I was unaware that all of this existed when I was working with him. But the book goes through and it talks about the racism in early Pentecostalism, which is problematic because Parham had a deep, heavy influence. And so Parham believed that the mixing of races was bad. He was also, as we mentioned, I think in the last episode, influenced strongly by John Alexander Dowie and by Frank Sanford, both of which were British Israelites, and they, at least Sanford, was spreading the works of C.A.L. Totten. So you've got early Pentecostalism that is influenced by Daniel Parker to some degree, who believed that the mixing of races is bad, and it's mixing British Israelism theology into this. But as we go forward, and we'll talk about the deeper connections, Parham also was a heavy influence on Wesley Swift, which is considered to be the father of Christian identity.
You mentioned the 1906 Azusa Street revival, the start of Pentecostalism. You had Parham there, and he was very much a white supremacist, very much believed this doctrine. And then you also had William Seymour. Now it's interesting, you had a black man there at Azusa Street, and you had Parham behind the scenes. I believe Seymour was a disciple of Parham, and what he saw in Kansas, I think he took out to California, and that's where they started that revival. But Parham was very much the father of it. And I guess the way I see Pentecostalism, there's two seeds or two branches of that. One branch had more of the mixed congregations and allowed, blacks and whites to mingle. There was that branch. And there was another branch, which was the part we're talking about, that believed the two seed line theory. And they wanted to stay separate. And to me, that's the evil side that we're exploring. Definitely not the true Christian side of the Pentecostal move of God, if you want to call it that. It definitely was the more evil side that we're exploring, because I don't see how anyone could, claim to be a Christian and hold to these kind of doctrines, which produces only hatred toward another group of people. You mentioned Wesley Swift, and he was the one that popularized the two seed line theory amongst all the white supremacist groups in the United States, and he promoted it within the Ku Klux Klan as well. So he was a heavy promoter of that, also was very much influential in the Pentecostal movement, and I think it has a lot of ties with our groups. But I know, like you said, Daniel Parker spreading those ideas, I'm sure that's and I always wondered where, Roy Davis, got these ideas from. But it had to have been in those communities that he was associated with in Texas, because by the time he came to Georgia and began working with Colonel Simmons, who started the Klan again, those ideas had already been entrenched in those areas. And being a rural community, I remember back in the days when I was growing up, we had a very rural community. People were living 1 to 2 miles apart or more. And you knew everyone in that community, and you knew where they went to church, or you knew what they believed. So I'm sure it was that way in Texas, with the limited number of people that lived probably in those territorial regions, that, and the states when they were had come to be a part of America, that there wasn't very populated. So you knew every neighbor that you had. And I'm sure you talked with them. You spent time, learning who they were and what they were about. And I know those ideas just spread like wildfire throughout that region. So Roy Davis very much had it entrenched in him by the time he came over to Georgia around 1915. But I believe there's evidence that, he was already a minister by 1915. But I believe as he became around 20 years old, sometime around 1901 or 1905, maybe around 20 years old, he began working with Simmons to develop the new Klan. And we'll go into that more as how this developed. But at some point, I believe well before 1915, he had worked with Simmons and came in contact with him. Because Roy, he was already fully developed in his ideas by the time he got to Georgia and began his trail, moving throughout the U.S., spreading this doctrine and promoting the Klan. So he was very well versed in it by the time he got there.
I would agree that the areas of influence are key, and understanding the historical lineage where one man influenced another is also key. People are going to wonder how we make the association or make that leap into connecting into the latter rain movements. Well, it's not just the influence of like the Dearborn Independent or, you take Daniel Parker, he was long before William Branham and the latter rain movements, but there are areas of location and there are people who are working together in those areas that's really where all of this starts to come together as we go forward. I'm jumping ahead a lot, but I'm excited about getting into this. Paris, Texas, for example, I mentioned that earlier. Well, Paris, Texas has so many weird connections. Paris, Texas, they had so many lynchings that whenever there was a trial, they called it the Court of Judge Lynch. In other words, if you have black skin, you're going to be lynched, basically, is what that amounted to. But William Branham, in some versions of his stage persona, he admitted that his family came from Paris, Texas. And, whether they knew Davis or not, we can't say, but it seems odd to me that Davis, who was also from Paris, Texas, went on his wild schemes throughout Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, Tennessee, and then landed up right in the very city where William Branham's family, who are also from Paris, Texas, that they came to the same place. That's really odd. And Joel Osteen, he was born in Paris, Texas. You can't really make the leap and say Joel Osteen was connected to Roy Davis because they were from Paris. That doesn't work, even though Davis was in the latter rain movement, but Davis had moved to, another state. But it's influence, it's culture. He grew up in this culture, and looking at the history of Paris itself, you can say that the culture was a racist culture because they were still racially segregated as late as 2006. And they prided itself in being racist. They said it's the best small town in Texas. At the same time that all of these, all these hate crimes, they had a history of hate crimes, the most infamous in all of Texas. So you got Roy Davis there. You've got William Branham's family there. You've got John Osteen. His father was in the latter rain movements, and he was, deeply connected. We'll get into that much later down the podcast, but all of this concentrated in the same city. And then as we further explore, there are other men in nearby cities who became pillars in what birthed the charismatic movement and the Word of Faith movement. So as we go along, you'll see that there are some geographical connections. But back to Roy Davis, it's key to understand the trail that he led from coast to coast, influencing people of great status in both politics and religion with his version of Christianity, which included the racial component. You don't see many documents labeling, in fact, you don't see many documents about Davis in general. He had a very secret life, but he was probably more key to the Christian identity movement than Wesley Swift, and Swift is recognized as basically the father of this thing. So as we get into this, we'll explore all of what I just said more, but understand that it's not just the human connections. There is a cultural aspect to it that we're going to explore as we go further in the podcast.
Yeah, I would agree with you. It's very much a cultural thing, and it was just so happened it was just the right time in America for all that to come together and to bring this type of doctrine that was very appealing to the culture of America, which was mostly a white culture, and I know that the white people, the white race, wanted to preserve all of that, and that was their means of doing it, is to use these type of vehicles. And this doctrine was just very appealing to them. The doctrine of British Israel also can be found, within the Latter-day Saints church as well. Joseph Smith even claimed that the descendants of lost tribes could be found on the American continent. So it's just everywhere. It can also be found, it was used to be found in the Worldwide Church of God with Herbert Armstrong, because Herbert Armstrong was a proponent of the serpent seed doctrine as well. But an interesting thing about Herbert Armstrong's church, after he died, and Armstrong was also influenced by the writings of John Allen. I believe we mentioned John Allen earlier. But in 1960s, his organization really expanded, and he died in 1977. But right after that, there's a doctrinal shift in the Worldwide Church of God. They're called themselves, I think, Grace Communion International now, and they have an official repudiation of British Israelism now. And I'm sure they also repudiate the serpent seed doctrine as well. But they totally went against Armstrong's teachings and established themselves as a new church, more evangelical, very more balanced. They may still keep the Sabbath day, Saturday as a Sabbath, but they're much more balanced than they used to be, which is a good thing. I think, if they're trying to serve God, that's a good thing to shift more biblical and get away from those doctrines. And I guess my personal desire would like to see all message ministers, come out of the message movement and balance their church with the Word of God and with scriptural teachings, and get back to, you say you want to get back to the Word, we'll get back to the true Word. That would be my desire. So we have a precedent there by the Worldwide Church of God. So if there's any message ministers listening to this podcast, I would exhort you to, take a look at all these things and get your church back balanced with the Word of God, and come out of these hurtful and harmful doctrines that you're embracing. It's interesting to note that even Amy Semple McPherson in the 1920s, she even appealed. Now, although she has, didn't appeal to the Ku Klux Klan and embraced their ideologies of hatred, she did appeal to them at one time to try to undermine the Roman Catholics who were critical of her work there. So she sided with the Klan at one time to leverage her, power to use their influence to tell her followers that, they don't need to listen to what the Roman Catholics were saying of her work around there and what she was doing in her evangelical efforts. But so her allies, it's kind of interesting that she would ally with the Klan. And I guess the Klan, as we get into that, the Klan kind of rang true with the culture of America. They may not have did a lot of bad things. They probably did some good things, because they had to do some good to be recognized as a valid order, even when they went to Washington to have those hearings. But and even Branham said that he'll never be able to forget what they did for him when they paid his hospital bill, back in that day when he was got shot and was 16 years old in the hospital, and they was able to pay his bill. So they did some good deeds, but underneath all that was all the bad deeds as well.
Exactly. And to further solidify this, not to go too deep because I don't want to jump too far ahead, but you mentioned Herb Armstrong, and Herb Armstrong obviously affiliated with the Church of God. Well, whenever Roy Davis's church was planted in Jeffersonville. He was the head of the Pentecostal Baptist Church of God sect, which was a new Pentecostal organization, because he had been kicked out of all of those other. He was kicked out of the Baptist. He was kicked, so there is a religious connection, but also, and we'll get into this probably, 10, 15 episodes in the future, but Herb Armstrong was ordained into the Church of God in Portland, Oregon, and he became the pastor there. I think it was 1831 that he was in the Oregon Conference of the Church of God. Well, in that area, when we start talking about geographical influence, that area was heavily influenced by British Israelism through the works of Reuben H. Sawyer. And he was a notorious Klan guy. In Portland, Oregon, there was an Oregon Klan that from 1921 to 1924 reigned in that area in Portland. And it was Reuben Sawyer that introduced the Klan to Portland when he addressed over 6,000 people in the municipal auditorium. That was in December of 1921. And R.H. Sawyer had ties back to Shreveport, Louisiana, which, as you know, became the early headquarters for the Voice of Healing magazine, William Branham's campaign team, basically. His influence there began around the same time that another character which we're introducing into the podcast, Gerald L. Smith, had moved from Indianapolis with the Indiana Klan down into Shreveport. So you've got all of these weird connections, and exploring the influences of those connections, I think, is fascinating. But that's for another episode down the future. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but needless to say, to sum up everything that we've said in this episode, you had all of these different ideologies which were false. If people today who still believe this serpent seed doctrine, there's a number of them that do. If they were to examine each of the foundations from which it was built upon, they would reject most of those foundations because they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-Jew, anti-Black, anti-Native American, and they're mixed with Jewish conspiracies and false translations, and even false histories of genealogies of people. All of the roots of this thing are purely wrong, but it's weird because they all combined, and each different varying group of person who ascribed to whatever is the belief that it was built upon, those people will hold to their beliefs until they die. They will defend these things even though they're false. And so Christian identity became this umbrella basically for all of these bad, really, really bad ideas. Christian identity became the tie that bound them all together. And so as this progresses, the identity framework becomes key to understanding how the latter rain movement was birthed and how it was evolved. And as we'll explore as we go further, the cultures surrounding the men who birthed it, I think, is key to understanding just why they did what they did.
Yeah, John, that's a good summary. I'll tell you, we've barely touched the surface of everything I had even written down that I was going to get into today, but we'll definitely get into that in future episodes. But regarding this, the doctrine that we're referring to, I think we have clearly shown that this serpent seed doctrine was never an original revelation that Branham received from an angel somewhere. This doctrine had been around for many, many years, and it was something that he was well acquainted with from the start. It was in his community, and it was something that he decided to incorporate into his message, that it was some exclusive revelation. But I think we've clearly shown that it was never a revelation. Or some new revelation. And we've also shown that it produces nothing but bad fruit. I mean, when you look where this, the trail of where this doctrine has gone and what it has eventually produced, and fortunately today, many of the Christian identity groups have become very, very low in number, and less as time has gone on. But it's produced nothing but bad fruit altogether. And also, I think we've shown that it doesn't even match what is in the natural order of things. Beast and human just cannot mate together. And it doesn't even meet the natural order. And I think we can show, if we wanted to, and maybe we might do that at some point, but we can show it's not even scriptural. If you follow the scriptures out and follow Genesis out step by step, it's not even scriptural. But it's just a matter of people throughout history have always, one person wants to exalt themselves above another. That's just the nature of human beings to do that. One person wants to rule over another. And so this is no different. This doctrine only produces in people that desire. And so it takes the heart out of Christianity, really, in the end, because Christianity is not about one ruling over another. We have one king, and we're not kings one over another. We're not rulers and having one class of people above another. But that's all the message produces, is one class of people, above another.
Exactly. And if you take a scriptural standpoint, you really can't make this work. You've got quotes where in the New Testament it's by one blood has every nation been birthed. What's really interesting, which we're, again, not to jump ahead, we're going to get into this more in the podcast, but when you examine the characters of the men who are introducing these are not Christian men. They're using deception to bring this. So the Bible also talks about in the New Testament the deception that would come into the church. Well, you mentioned William Branham, and not to focus on him, he's a side story, but it is key to understanding that he brought this into the latter rain, which exploded into all of these weird, unusual pseudo-Christianity. I should quote the word Christian, pseudo-Christianity movements. But he claimed it as divine revelation in, it was the year 1958. He claimed that this was a mystery that he received from God. But if you have access to search his sermons, he admits that he learned the racial version of this in Roy Davis's church, which we'll get into as we progress through time into about the early 30s. We'll cover that. But even in his own sermons, before he preaches the serpent seed, the sermon with the title Serpent Seed, as early as 1953, he was preaching Wesley Swift's version. And the quote is, he said, "Nimrod was a son of Ham, which come back on from the son of Cain. Watch them seeds as they come up." That was an exact replica of Wesley Swift, the father of Christian identity, the one who popularized the two-seed doctrine in the United States. Branham is saying the exact same things that Swift has been teaching, and Swift is out in California after the birth of the California Klan. He's literally the second in command of the California Klan, which we'll explore when we get into approximately the 1940s. So not to jump too far ahead, but just to give the listeners a view of what's coming, we're going to explore how this two-seed doctrine and all of these other things that we've talked about, the Jewish conspiracy, all of the dirty politics, and basically, to sum it up, all of the deceivers who came into the church. We're going to be exploring this through time as we go, but we had to lay this foundation of the two seeds, because to understand Christian identity, you have to understand that there was an intent by evil-minded men to create a doctrine that could sever the body of Christ, one that could take you as a listener and convince you that you could become an elitist and that there's a subclass of humans and you could see yourself as better than the subclass who are doomed to hell. That if you follow it all out to its logical conclusion, that's where it leads. But anyway, we'll get to those in the upcoming shows, and if you've enjoyed our show and you want more information, you can check us out on the web. You can find us at william-branham.org. For more information about the dark side of latter rain, read Weaponized Religion, From Latter Rain to Colonia Dignidad, available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible. And to learn more about Roy Davis and this trail that's leading to William Branham, you can read The Persuasive Preacher, The Gifted Prophet, and The Noble Politician, also available on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible.